It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Gigabyte M27Q. As usual for a video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately it depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so in no way does it accurately represent what the monitor would look like firsthand. As usual, there's a written review which accompanies this, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. This monitor uses a 27-inch IPS type panel. It's an IPS type panel from Sharp. It's a little bit different to most others on the market, and it has a 2560 by 1440 WQHD resolution, supports a 170Hz refresh rate. The combination of screen size and resolution gives you a good pixel density, so there's a good useful workspace, good clarity potential as well. So it's good for multitasking, that kind of thing. Text's pretty crisp, decent size. Something I will mention early on is this monitor has a BGR, blue, green, red, rather than RGB, red, green, blue, subpixel layout. And it does have some fringing issues, and that's to say that sometimes you can see a slight border of cyan on one side and magenta on the other side of objects, particularly white objects, and this can happen around text as well. A lot of this, at least with the text, is cut down if you set up ClearType correctly. Most Windows users will be using ClearType. So if you type ClearType into the box there in Windows 10, for example, you can then go on this ClearType text tuner, and what you want to do is make sure that the first sample set here is set to the second one there, and that sets Windows to expect the BGR subpixel layout. You should say on this model that the first one looks finer and it has a bit of fringing to it, so that sort of cyan, it can be green, it can be kind of magenta, depends on your perspective on things, but to me it's a sort of cyan and magenta fringe. But the second set there should look bolder and better. The rest of them, you can actually just set them according to your preferences. It doesn't really matter what you do there. Once you've done that, most text is cleared up, but there are some examples of fringing which will remain, and it's not just text which this will affect, and I go through that in the written review, so refer to that. This isn't an issue which most users are going to notice. It really is just a small minority of users who are going to notice this or find it bothersome, so don't worry about it and don't dismiss this monitor for that reason. But if you look at the start of the calibration section of the written review, this is all covered in quite some detail. And I'm going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So as you can see, it has a pretty basic, homely design, as I like to call it. It has lots of dark matte plastics. The stand base is a low profile design with a step. It actually has a little band of glossy plastic between the two steps, just on the forward facing bit there. But it's mainly matte black plastic, and you don't really see that glossy band, to be honest, or I don't notice it. So it's a pretty basic stand design, really, kind of hollowed out, not particularly high quality look or feel to it, in my opinion. Certainly if you compare to the Gigabyte Aorus models with their powder coated metal. It's a bit more basic than that, but it does the job. And the monitor itself is pretty firm on the stand. It doesn't wobble about excessively or anything like that. There's also a cable tidy loop in the middle of the stand neck, and you can also see some more glossy plastic there, depending on the height you've got the monitor at. The bottom bezel is just matte black plastic, single stage, pretty much covers the panel border. At the top and sides you can see the panel border because it uses a dual stage design, so that means that there is some panel border, but it's flush with the rest of the screen, and when the monitor's switched off, as it is now, it's quite difficult to see it. You will be able to see it if I've got the camera at this angle. But when the monitor's switched on, you can certainly see that panel border. And then there's a hard plastic outer component as well, very slender, just around the screen. The screen surface is what I would classify as very light matte anti-glare. So this room is not particularly bright, and because it's very light matte anti-glare, it does mean you can get some slightly sharper reflections than you'd get, or some slightly sharper patches of glare, I should say, than you'd get on some matte screen surfaces. So the glare handling isn't quite as strong as on some. But on the plus side, it doesn't give you a clear layered appearance to the image, and it's better for preserving clarity and vibrancy. So I actually quite like this kind of screen surface myself. I'm a fan of glossy monitors, some of you might be aware, which are very few and far between on the market. At the side, the monitor is quite slim at the thinnest point, bulks out a little bit centrally where the stand attaches. You can also see the mechanism that attaches the stand and the screen. That offers some reasonable ergonomic flexibility. You can adjust the height of the screen. I wouldn't say the height adjustment is the smoothest operation, So I'm sorry about those noises for those of a nervous disposition. As you can hear, it's not like a smooth, silent glide or anything like that. It's a little bit noisy, but it does the trick. You can also tilt the screen, so that's fully tilted backwards and fully tilted forwards. At the rear of the monitor, you can see that there is glossy fingerprint and dust magnet, as I like to call it, black plastic, but just at the top, and it's at the back, so I don't really mind too much about that. I never really see that, it's always facing my wall. The rest of it is matte black plastic, and there's an M27Q logo in sort of a medium grey towards the top left there. And there's also some little engraved patterns up there, just a little design feature. The stand attaches centrally with 100 by 100mm VESA holes, and you can unscrew that and attach an alternative 100 by 100mm VESA compatible solution if you prefer. The OSD controls are found towards the bottom left here, so there's the joystick, there's also the dedicated KVM button, and this is all explored in the OSD video that accompanies this review. And I didn't mention before, but in terms of the depth of the monitor, it's quite good. It's a fairly compact design, it doesn't take up a lot of depth on the desk. I give exact measurements in the written review in the features and aesthetics section if you're interested in that kind of thing. And you'll also see that there's a little bit of a section missing from the stand. It has sloped, angled design, which means you can have your keyboard at an angle in the middle of the stand, or you can have other things sitting there if you want. The ports face downwards, so you can see nice little port labels there, quite clear actually. So you've got a 3.5mm headphone jack. You've got two HDMI 2.0 ports which support up to 144Hz at the native 2560 by 1440 resolution, also HDR compatible, and will support AMD FreeSync on compatible GPUs. You've got a DisplayPort 1.2A Plus input, which means it has HDR support, and it supports up to 170Hz at the native 2560 by 1440 resolution. Also supports adaptive sync, including AMD FreeSync, and also NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode on compatible GPUs. There's USB Type-C port, which only offers 15-watt power delivery, I believe it is. You can check that in the written review in case I misspoke there. So that's not a massive amount of power delivery. I'm afraid that's quite typical on these gaming monitors to have a fairly low power delivery. Unfortunately, that's just how it is at the moment, but it does give you a bit of power delivery. It gives you data transfer, and it also has DisplayPort Alt mode. There's then a USB 3 upstream port and two USB 3 downstream ports, and a DC power input, which means this monitor has an external power brick rather than an internal power converter. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about contrast using some in-game examples. I wasn't actually expecting to load this particular scene. I don't usually show this one. It gives you a bit of variety, so I'll run with it anyway. As a monitor with an IPS type panel, contrast really isn't the main strength. I did measure around 1200:1 for my static contrast, and that's after the adjustments made to my test settings. That's actually pretty strong for an IPS type panel. It's certainly quite a bit stronger than competing models with LG Nano IPS panels, for example. We also have to take into account IPS glow. That's a big feature on IPS type models like this, or certainly a feature at least. And because I got the camera mounted fairly centrally, you can actually see that in all four corners of the screen. It is exaggerated a bit on the camera, and it isn't something which you will notice in a brighter room. And I'll brighten up the room a little bit later so I can show you this. But it does eat away at the atmosphere. And also my unit has a bit of backlight bleed towards the bottom at least, particularly the bottom right corner, which brings out the IPS glow a bit more strongly. So some units will be a bit better than my one. But you can see this kind of hazing. It looks quite warm in some regions, kind of greenish gold in other regions. That's how I'd describe it. And actually, my unit also has a bit of backlight bleed towards the top left as well. But I've got to say, I don't usually game in a dark room like this, and it isn't something which I find as obnoxious as it will appear here on the camera and in this dark room. But if you do like to sit in a dark room and game, or dimmer lighting, then IPS type models like this, they just don't give you a deep atmospheric performance. That's really not what they're all about. A real strength of the IPS type panel though, when it comes to contrast, it's not strictly related to contrast, but I like to slot it in here anyway, is the gamma consistency is excellent. So that means the overall detail level, and actually this scene's turned out to be quite a good one for testing contrast. I might use it in the future, but when I'm talking about detail, so sort of the finer details like the vegetation here, on TN models what you'll find is further up the screen that'll all be masked and too much of that detail is ebbed away at. And lower down, there's actually far too much detail, and that can give things a banded or blocky appearance. On VA models, it tends to be that, or it is always actually, that the centre of the screen has black crush. It can vary between panels, but there's always some black crush. And that means that dark shades are darker than they should be, things are too blended together, whereas peripherally, so towards the side edges and bottom edges from a normal viewing position, you can see too much detail on some VA models, or certainly either way you're going to see a lot more detail than you do centrally. So IPS type models like this, they're much more consistent with the gamma in that respect. For brighter shades, I quite like the screen surface on this model. So this model has a very light matte anti-glare screen surface. As I mentioned when I was talking about the external features of the monitor, the aesthetics. So that prevents a layered appearance in front of the image. It doesn't have an obvious layered appearance. The light emission is more direct in that respect than many matte screen surfaces. And it also means that brighter content, such as the lights in the background there, which I have to say looks a bit more like that to the eye, just the exposure of the camera sort of causes it all to get crushed together. It looks a bit more like that. And sort of the smoothness is there. It doesn't have the kind of graininess that some matte screen surfaces offer. I'm quite sensitive to this graininess, and I find this screen surface quite agreeable, so that's a good thing in my book. Most users are going to be absolutely fine with this screen surface, going to find it quite nice. I've brightened the room up, it's moderately bright now, and you can see, or more to the point, you can't see that IPS glow as strongly at all. So these are the kind of conditions which I'd say really work much better for panels like this, IPS type panels, and actually just LCDs in general. If you're going to be sitting in a dark room, I would recommend having some kind of lighting behind the monitor, bias lighting, Philips Hue lighting. You can sort of customize that, it's quite nice. They have various different solutions there which can be used. So I would definitely recommend that. Otherwise, you are going to have issues. You're going to notice issues with dark uniformity, so you're not going to have nice depth, because that's just not what monitors like this deliver. And speaking of that IPS glow, I said it can be brought out a bit more notably on some models if you've got issues with dark uniformity, and my unit isn't awful in that respect, but does have some issues, which does bring that IPS glow out a bit more. And of course you can notice the issues themselves as well. Another thing which would cause extra IPS glow is if you have the brightness increased, if you're using a higher brightness level, and also if you are sitting closer to the screen, it's brought out more noticeably. So I tend to sit around 70 to 80 centimeters from the screen. That's my normal viewing position. It varies a little bit depending on my posture, how I'm sitting, that kind of thing. But that's roughly how I like to sit. And really from this distance, this is much in line with other 27-inch IPS type models I've used when it comes to IPS glow. I'm going to focus on colour reproduction now, and to start off I like to use Lagom, that's lagom.nl, the website, and the test for viewing angles. So the Lagom text here, it looks a nice blended grey throughout. It looks a little bit more red for the striping to the text towards the bottom of the screen, a bit more greenish towards the top, but it doesn't have obvious flashes of orange or saturated reds and greens as you'd get with models with weaker viewing angles. So this indicates a low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor, pretty typical for an IPS type model. This block always looks a bit weird on the camera, so I'm not going to spend too long going through this, but it basically looks a pinkish purple to my eye throughout. It's pretty consistent. The red block, very nice, good, consistent, rich red throughout the screen. And the green block, that appears a good saturated green chartreuse throughout. Again, it doesn't have any issues where some regions of the screen are clearly more yellow than others, as TN models in particular would show, and VA models show this to a good degree as well. So it's nice and consistent in that respect. Blue block, good, rich, royal blue throughout the screen. Although that's not really saying much, this block often looks very consistent, but brightness uniformity issues can also affect it, but on my unit at least, this shade looks really nice and consistent. I'm on Battlefield 5 now, and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. This monitor's colour gamut is quite generous. It extends quite a bit beyond sRGB, actually measured 95% of the DCI-P3 colour space, and actually it covers a lot of Adobe RGB. There's a bit of undercoverage of Adobe RGB in some regions and some overcoverage in others, just like there's some overcoverage of DCI-P3 in some regions of the gamut. But I would recommend looking at the colour reproduction section of the written review, so you can see the exact gamut I measured and the percentages compared to various colour spaces. But what this means, if you're looking at most content, such as the game I'm playing here, but this would extend more broadly, lots of content you just look at when you're browsing the internet, that kind of thing. This is really mainly designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, certainly typical for games under SDR like this, and when you're watching movies and that kind of thing. And what this means is that with the generous colour gamut here, extending quite a bit beyond sRGB, things look more saturated than they should. They look more vibrant. This is a look that some users really like. Other people don't like it so much. But the way that it's achieved here is very different to if you increase the digital saturation. So if you increase the saturation slider, or this monitor has a feature called Colour Vibrance. If you increase that, things look really cartoonish, things are crushed together, you lose your shade variety, and that's because shades are taken closer to the edge of the gamut without the gamut itself being expanded. So the most saturated shades remain the same, but shades that should be less saturated appear a lot more saturated than they should. With this back in the neutral position, and it's just the gamut with the extra saturation, the shade variety is all there. There's good spacing on the gamut between shades, so you get a nice variety of shades. And if you like, you can actually reduce that a bit to take a bit of the edge off the saturation, but I find the balance is very difficult to get right. And I talk about that a bit more in the OSD video when I talk about this particular feature and various other features of the monitor. But with the consistency as well, the consistency of the panel, which I talked about with reference to Lagom earlier, the strong colour consistency, it means that the saturation levels, the richness is maintained throughout the screen. So these fires here, there are shades there which are way beyond the sRGB colour space thanks to the generous gamut, and because of the strong colour consistency, it maintains that rich look, that vibrant look throughout the screen. And again, some people are really going to like this look. And if you look beyond gaming, it's actually quite useful having this kind of colour gamut, or the potential is there to use that if you've got work within the Adobe RGB colour space or the DCI P3 colour space. So the vibrant shades, definitely there. It does mean that some shades appear a bit unnatural. So some of the green shades, for example, they appear just too saturated. Some of the yellowish greens, the yellow components are brought out a bit too strongly as well. And you get the same with browns. So the woods of these rifles, for example, they look a bit too orange. The red shades, the orange shades, brought out too strongly. They don't look as much of a neutral brown as they should. The monitor also offers an sRGB emulation setting. So if you change picture mode to sRGB, that clamps things to the sRGB gamut, so the coverage extends just to that and no further. And that tones down this extra saturation. Things look more as the developers intend. Things to be aware of though, for example, the rifle there certainly looks more realistic. So the push towards the reds and oranges has gone. And again, some of the green shades look more muted, more appropriate. So if you do like this kind of look, then you can do that. Just be aware that you can't change the color channels as usual for an sRGB emulation setting. You can't change the gamma either, but you can at least adjust the brightness, which is better flexibility than some sRGB settings give you. Sometimes the brightness is locked, so at least it's more usable in that respect. As I show in the written review, the color gamut isn't perfectly aligned with sRGB. It's not too bad in that respect. But either way, it gets rid of that extra saturation. There's really no right or wrong answer as to which mode you should use. It's just according to your own preferences. You might find that on some game titles you like using this mode, others you actually prefer the native gamut, and that's absolutely fine. You know, it's all about personal preferences, because the sRGB color space is very restrictive. There are lots of shades in the real world which you will not see with the sRGB color space in mind. They're just way beyond that. So it's really personal preferences whether you want things to look as the developers intend, even if they're a little restrictive gamut, or if you prefer extra saturation and vibrancy. I'm back on Shadow of the Tomb Raider and I'm running the game in HDR, high dynamic range. So it uses HDR10 like most movies and game titles you'll use on the PC and indeed on the console. And this is the most widely supported HDR standard. VESA also has their own certification system for different levels of HDR, if you like. This one is VESA Display HDR 400 certified, so that's the lowest level. It's only a basic HDR experience, so I'm going to just quickly run through what that brings you. So one thing is that you have 10-bit color reproduction used rather than just 8-bit in the pipeline. This monitor is actually using an 8-bit panel, but it uses dithering on the GPU to fill in the gaps, so to speak, and that works very well. I've talked about this on previous videos, and I've reviewed some models where it will do this with some refresh rates to save bandwidth, whereas other refresh rates it'll actually have the dithering handled on the monitor. And the difference between the two is really very slight, so don't worry about it. Just take my word for it, it's only a slight difference. And what this does is it enhances the nuanced shade variety. So there's a better selection of closely matching dark shades, for example. So that gives a natural uplift to shadow detail. And it's very different to the look you get if you enhance the gamma, use a gamma enhancement under SDR, which doesn't improve your shade variety, it just kind of gives an artificial uplift. It's a nice little benefit of HDR, things definitely look different. And it's not just the dark shades, it also affects the brighter shades, I'll come onto that shortly. But just sticking with these dark shades again, VESA Display HDR 400 is very limited in this respect. There's no local dimming used here, so the monitor just has its backlight brightness at one particular setting. and that's used all the time. It doesn't employ any dynamic contrast, which I would say is a bit disappointing actually. I'm not a massive fan of dynamic contrast in general, but if it's used properly under HDR, it can be enhanced with HDR metadata, which enhances the precision and means the adjustments made are actually more appropriate and less annoying than they can be under SDR or just generally. So that can work quite well. The ViewSonic XG270QC, that's the VA model, is one example of a model which uses very effective dynamic contrast under HDR. That works quite well. Of course, not as good as local dimming, but better than nothing. On this model instead, you actually set the brightness manually. So I've got it set to 100, which is full brightness, and that's really the only setting I would recommend using under HDR, just because otherwise things have a very un-HDR-like look. The bright elements are far too subdued, and actually some of the colours get subdued. It's a little bit odd. Under HDR, the colour reproduction is kind of tied to the luminance more closely than it would be under SDR. So really HDR is supposed to be experienced with local dimming or illumination which varies throughout the screen and varies for different shades, different shade depths, that kind of thing. So if you don't have that, then it doesn't really have a proper HDR look. But that applies regardless of what you've got the brightness set to. It's just that if you set it any lower, and it's under HDR, it says there HDR on at the top, and a lot of this is grayed out. It doesn't matter which preset you use either. For example, there's no sRGB setting, and I'll come on to the colour gamut used under HDR shortly. Some of the settings apply an extra sharpness filter. If you like that kind of look, then fair enough, you can use one of the settings which applies that more strongly. I think the reader mode does that to some extent, and the movie mode is quite a strong one. But the main thing you adjust here is brightness, which, as I said, got it set to 100. If you reduce that, if you don't like the high brightness, then by all means, that's fine, do that. But to me, things just look far too muted there. Again, some colours just have lost depth. The overall scene just doesn't look as it should under HDR at all. So I'm going to stick to 100 brightness for the rest of this. Oh, and if you like quite a strong sharpness filter, incidentally, if you go into gaming, you can actually change the super resolution. So if you increase this, it applies a fairly strong sharpness filter. And as you can see there, you can adjust the overdrive. You can also use adaptive sync when you're using HDR, and that works with AMD and NVIDIA GPUs. I'm actually using an RTX 3090 at the moment, and I've got adaptive sync active as it happens. It doesn't change the performance under HDR at all. And speaking of changing performance or not changing performance, I'm using DisplayPort, but I tested under HDMI, very similar experience. I tested with my AMD GPU, again, very similar experience. So, of course, if you're using an HDR compatible games console, you're going to be using HDMI, and usually the chipset's AMD, the graphics chipset. So really the experience that I'm talking about here applies more broadly to games consoles under HDR as well. And if you're looking at HDR film content, which is another thing I did. But for me, scenes like this really separate very good HDR performers from not so good ones. And this one, it's kind of middling. It's not the worst I've seen, but I have to say that it doesn't have a particularly high brightness, so the luminance is, 400 candles per meter squared is the requirement for VESA Display HDR 400. It slightly exceeded that, but only very slightly, actually. I think it was very close to 400. So it doesn't give great pop to these bright elements, and because it isn't local dimming, the surrounding dimmer shades aren't any dimmer. The high brightness is used throughout the screen, so not a wonderful look at all. Not an HDR-like look in this respect, and really the depth of some of these shaded areas should be much better than they are. I've tried to adjust the camera a bit so it shows the nuanced shade variety at the high end, but of course it isn't an HDR video. You may well not be using an HDR monitor anyway, running it in HDR, etc. So you're not going to be able to see what things actually look like firsthand. But the nuanced shade variety for these brighter shades, it helps weather effects, it helps sort of the mist here, and the light effects look more natural, with more natural progressions, smoother progressions, nice smooth gradients. So it certainly does have a nice effect in that respect. So on a bit of a different scene now, still running the game under HDR. And the other aspect of HDR which I'd like to talk about is colour reproduction. So now the developers are targeting the DCI P3 colour space as their near-term target. They've also got Rec 2020 in mind. So ideally your HDR monitor would fully cover Rec 2020. That gives you sort of the full vibrancy, but developers are still aware that most displays are closer to DCI P3, if anything, if they even get there under HDR. so they have to make sure the content actually looks decent there as well. This monitor, as I mentioned, 95% DCI-P3 color space coverage. It actually extends a bit beyond that for some green shades. I actually quite like how it shows green shades, this monitor, in terms of its color reproduction in the HDR, so you don't have that extra yellowing I observed under SDR. Things look very vibrant still. There's some really nice lush green shades and a good variety of brighter green shades, but they look a lot more appropriate than they do under SDR. And really the very generous colour gamut helps in that respect. Again, because there isn't local dimming, and as I mentioned earlier on, it does mean that things don't look as vibrant or as lush or as deep as they could, regardless of the colour gamut and how things are set up. But the colour gamut still helps. These flowers as well are quite eye-catching, nice and blue, and there are these shades which are well beyond the sRGB colour space being shown here. So really things look more natural, but the vibrant elements are still there, and actually some of them are there arguably to a greater extent than under SDR. But in general, if you're running the game under SDR, then you switch to HDR, your initial thoughts on the colour might be that things somehow look washed out. I've heard people describe it as. They probably wouldn't describe this model as washed out, but just in general, that's actually just because you've been used to these greatly oversaturated shades. Things are now appearing more as they should, more natural, but still with the vibrant elements. If you actually look at sort of the finer details, the elements that should be vibrant, they are. Another example would be the fire here, for example. Has a nice vibrant look to it. Under SDR though, some of the oranges are brought out too strongly and look kind of a reddish orange. Here it's a more natural look. Again, local dimming would definitely help here, or better luminance control can help with the shade depth there. And some of the blues for these dresses, for example, they don't look as lush as I've seen on some models, and actually the fire I showed you before just then and these dresses, they could have done with a bit of extra richness. And it's not just the local dimming, the colour gamut extending a bit more could help a little bit in that respect as well, but it certainly is far from the weakest HDR performance I've seen. But really, HDR on this monitor, it's a bonus. It's something which I think some people are going to quite enjoy. If you haven't seen better HDR performance, then you might quite like it. I have seen better HDR performances, so it doesn't wow me in any way, but it's still quite usable, and it can be nice. It makes things look quite different, so it can be nice for a bit of variety. I'm on Battlefield 5 now, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has a 170Hz refresh rate, and I've got this game running at pretty solid 170 frames a second. You can see the frame rate towards the top right, with the green text there. This gives you two main advantages. This high frame rate, high refresh rate combination. One is that it improves the connected feel, and that describes how things feel when you interact with the game world, this fluidity and the precision. This is also aided by low input lag. With this model, I measured around 4 milliseconds of input lag. So it's not super low, but it is low, and it's certainly low enough that most users are going to find it absolutely fine in that respect. And it certainly isn't indicative of a low signal delay, which is the main element of input lag that you feel. The other advantage to having this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination is that it greatly reduces the perceived blur. And this is talked about in the written review and an article all about responsiveness on the website. I'm not going to waste my time going through that here, but it is something which is closely linked to refresh rate. Most of the perceived blur you see is due to your eye movement rather than the pixel responses of the monitor. So this increase in frame rate and refresh rate, it gives you a good edge in perceived blur, a good reduction in perceived blur due to eye movement. Pixel responses are still important though, and this monitor does very well in that respect, I'm pleased to say. It's not perfect, there are some weaknesses, but I would stress they are minor weaknesses. So I often talk about powdery trailing, and this is really, it's just kind of a spectrum of what I'd classify as powdery trailing. Sometimes there's light powdery trailing, which doesn't really affect perceived blur very much. It's the kind of thing that most users aren't going to notice. Sometimes there's heavy powdery trailing, which has the tendency to be potentially more noticeable, especially to sensitive users, but it's not smeary trailing or anything like that. This monitor generally gives you light powdery trailing and a little bit of sort of moderate or moderate to heavy powdery trailing, but it's mainly light, especially for these transitions here. They're mainly between medium and lighter shades, and here this monitor performs them very well indeed. It does a lot of justice to that 170Hz refresh rate. There are some slight weaknesses, as I mentioned. So for these brighter shades and for very dark shades, sometimes the powdery trailing appears a bit more noticeable. So the text here, for example, shows a bit more of it, but it's not extreme, it's not smeary, it's not like what you'd see on a VA model. It isn't quite as good overall in terms of the perceived blur and just considering this powdery trailing in general. It isn't quite as good as LG's Nano IPS models, for example, but it's quite a bit better than models with the Innolux panel that I've tested. So the Gigabyte Aorus FI27QP, for example, and also the BenQ EX2780Q. They have more noticeable perceived blur, they have more significant issues. So really, I think this model is one that many users are going to be very happy with in terms of its pixel responsiveness. It does have adjustable overdrive settings, but another nice thing about this model, you can just use the lower setting, which is called picture quality. And by the way, there is an auto setting here as well. I don't know what that's supposed to do. All it seems to do is set this to balance. And if you set it to balance, it just gives you quite noticeable overshoot. So you can now see inverse ghosting. You can see some colourful elements introduced around the walls there, which weren't there before. It does technically speed up pixel responses, and technically I suppose you don't get that sort of powdery trailing I was mentioning before, but it's actually just replaced by shadowy trailing, dark overshoot. It doesn't look very nice at all. And you can see this more clearly in the written review with the pursuit photographs that are included in the responsiveness section there, but there's actually overdrive artifacts as well, so it's not just sort of plain overshoot, it actually has a hatched appearance as well, which I find really quite distracting and quite annoying. So this setting, it could appeal to some users, but to me it really doesn't deliver anything that's attractive. The picture quality setting, I just stick with that. Oh, and the speed setting, just for completeness. Really strong overshoot now. Bright colourful trailing all over the place. And just to show you the auto setting, just in case you didn't believe what I said, just the same as balanced. So back to my preferred picture quality setting now, and onto a different scene. I'm now on a different scene on Battlefield 5. This one is dominated more by dark transitions. It has plenty of dark shades, I should say. And these can be very unforgiving. If some of you have seen my other videos, particularly with VA models, you might break out into a bit of a cold sweat when I start talking about this scene. You might have some horrible memories of this smeary trailing and that kind of thing. Really can be shown very clearly here, and strange flickering that can occur due to slow pixel responses as well for some of these objects. But here, that isn't a problem. There isn't the smeary trailing, nothing like that. There is, again, some powdery trailing, and it does add a bit to perceived blur, but it's really quite minor. And overall, it still makes good use of the 170Hz refresh rate. There aren't really any standout weaknesses as I described them. So again, smeary trailing, none of that. Heavy powdery trailing, not really. A little bit sort of moderate powdery trailing, I guess I might call it. So sort of the transitions up there, for example, show a bit of this powdery trailing, a bit more noticeable than some of the other transitions, but nothing that I'd really lose sleep over. And another nice thing, there just isn't any noticeable overshoot. I've increased the graphics settings a lot, and my frame rate is now substantially below 170 frames a second. It's closer to 90 to 100 frames a second just at the moment. This monitor supports adaptive sync, and that works with NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode on a compatible NVIDIA GPU, such as the RTX 3090 I'm using right now. I've also tested AMD FreeSync using an AMD RX 580, and FreeSync worked in a very similar way. There were some very minor differences, which I'll come on to shortly, but it was very similar. The main thing the technology does, whether it's FreeSync or NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, works in very much the same way. It ensures that the refresh rate of the display matches the frame rate where possible. That gets rid of tearing and stuttering. So usually if you had VSync enabled, you would get clear stuttering, whereas if you had VSync disabled, you'd get clear tearing. With adaptive sync, you don't get either issue. That would be down to frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. You can have stuttering for other reasons, but they're not because of frame rate and refresh rate mismatches, because of this, if this technology is doing its thing, which it certainly does here. Another thing is the reduction in frame rate. Yes, it is notable to me. The connected feel isn't as good. There's more perceived blur. but the lack of tearing and stuttering is very nice, and you'll see actually sometimes the frame rate dips closer to 60 or 70 frames a second. That really decreases the connected feel and increases the perceived blur even more, but again, lack of tearing and stuttering, easy to appreciate if you're sensitive to those things, as I am. This monitor doesn't have a lot of overshoot though. Again, I'm using that picture quality setting, and that works well throughout the variable refresh rate range. So there is a little bit of overshoot now, around the tree there, for example, but it's not substantial at all, not eye-catching. I think it's really very impressive actually how well the picture quality setting works across the entire variable refresh rate range, I have to say. And speaking of variable refresh rate range, with this one it will go down to 48 Hz if you are using AMD FreeSync, and I actually measured 55 Hz with NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. It was a little bit lower than that if I decreased the refresh rate, so instead of 170 or 165 Hz, I decreased that to 144, I believe it was 53 Hz, the floor of operation, and with the refresh rate set to 120 Hz, that would go down to 50 Hz. You can see the exact figures in the written review where I write this all down. It doesn't really make any substantial difference in practice. And when the monitor goes below 48 frames a second as an AMD user, or below 55 frames a second with implementation I'm using at the moment, G-Sync compatible mode, 170 Hz selected as my refresh rate, then it employs LFC, or frame to refresh multiplication technology, that works very effectively to keep tearing and stuttering at bay. The only thing I'd say is that, and I'd say this with any monitor that uses adaptive sync, there is a bit of stuttering when it activates or deactivates, so it isn't a very smooth crossover between the technology being used and not used. For most users that isn't a problem, you'll only occasionally be passing the boundary, so it's not an issue, but if you happen to be running at a frame rate which is sort of frequently a little bit below, a little bit above, or you're just frequently passing that boundary, that could potentially be annoying. That is really just an issue more generally with adaptive sync monitors, not specific to this one. And some monitors have issues with flickering, that they're sensitive to voltage control, that kind of thing. I didn't observe anything like that on this one with my NVIDIA or AMD GPU. So that was really nice to see, or not see, should I say. And I should actually just make a small correction here. When I said that the floor of operation is 48 Hz with AMD, sometimes it seemed to be slightly above that. I'm not quite sure why. Sometimes it seemed to activate LFC a little bit above that, maybe 50 to 52 Hz. But again, I wouldn't lose sleep over this difference. It really makes very little difference in practice. And again, LFC does its thing anyway below that. But for me, it's really nice having adaptive sync, and I do like how it's implemented here because there aren't issues with flickering, there aren't issues with overshoot to worry about, that kind of thing. So in terms of adaptive sync with my NVIDIA or AMD GPU, a really nice implementation here. And actually the overall responsiveness experience, really quite praiseworthy on this model. I will also briefly just tag in at the end here, this monitor has what's called aim stabilizer, which is a strobe backlight setting. I'm not going to cover that here in the video review because all you see is obnoxious flickering. You can't see any of the benefits. But I talk about this in the written review quite extensively. I don't love the implementation here. I haven't actually ever liked Gigabyte's aim stabilizer setting, if I'm honest. It always seems to have some issues. Strobe crosstalk issues. In this case, strong overshoot issues with the technology active. And you have to have your frame rate matching the refresh rate exactly, so it's not ideal, and you can't use adaptive sync at the same time. And there's also locked brightness, so I think for most users this isn't a setting that's going to be of much utility, but I do like to mention that it is a setting you can use if you want to. Just refer to the written review, which is a better medium for exploring that kind of setting. To wrap up then, I think there's a lot to like about this monitor. It does tick a lot of boxes, gives you decent ergonomics, at least gives you height adjustment and tilt adjustment, which are the main ones people use. If you want better ergonomic flexibility, you can use an alternative 100 by 100mm VESA compatible solution instead. It gives you quite a basic stand in terms of the design. You know, nothing flashy, no powder coated metals, nothing luxurious like that. It does the job. Another thing that does the job is the resolution and screen size. It's decent, 2560 by 1440, 27 inches. Gives you a decent amount of desktop real estate, decent clarity to suitably high resolution content, that kind of thing. There are some issues with fringing, which I mentioned more in the written review, but really I don't want to go through these in too much detail here because they're only going to affect a minority of users, and it isn't something that I think most users should really concern themselves with. The contrast performance was very much in line with my expectations for the panel type, but actually still quite a bit stronger than some competing models, particularly those with LG's Nano IPS panels, which tend to have static contrast, which is probably around 400:1 on average, lower than this one, so there's a bit of a difference there. The usual IPS glow applied here. The screen surface I found quite agreeable. It didn't have a clear grainy look to it, actually. It looked quite smooth, and it didn't have a clear layering in front of the image either, so I found it quite nice. The colour reproduction, generous colour gamut, which extends well beyond sRGB, actually good DCI-P3 and Adobe RGB coverage as well. Not perfect coverage of either of those colour spaces, a little bit of extra coverage in some regions, some under coverage in others, but it does give you the potential to use this monitor for colour critical work. But for that, I would always recommend using a colorimeter or a similar device, calibrating and recalibrating your own unit with your own calibration hardware. But for general use and games, it gives a vibrant look to the image, extra saturation. Not to everyone's taste, but this monitor does have an sRGB emulation mode, which at least has adjustable brightness, so it's better than some if you want to tone down colours. It also has saturation sliders if you want to just play with that kind of thing and adjust the saturation according to your own taste. The colour consistency was very strong, good IPS type performance there, so it kept shades looking vibrant and saturated throughout the screen, so without clear perceived gamma shifts as you get with TN and VA models. The gamut was certainly put to good use under HDR, and I think the colour aspects of HDR are probably the most praiseworthy. In terms of contrast, very basic experience. Vestige for HDR 400, no dynamic contrast with HDR metadata used, no dynamic contrast at all under HDR in fact. Manual brightness control, which is a bit of an odd one to have under HDR to be honest. And no local dimming either, so really just a very basic experience. Peak end luminance around 400 candles per meter squared, so not a true HDR experience, but not the worst I've seen either. In terms of responsiveness, ticks a lot of boxes there as well. Low input lag, good overall pixel responses, only minor weaknesses really, and the nice thing is you can use the picture quality setting regardless of your refresh rate, and it doesn't inject obnoxious overshoot as your refresh rate decreases, as it would if you're using adaptive sync and your frame rate decreases. So you can just use the lowest setting there, picture quality, throughout the variable refresh rate range, and it worked nicely. And that was with both NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode and with AMD FreeSync. When you put all of this together and you consider that this is a budget offering, I think it's really a very attractive offering. I know some of you will be watching this and thinking, how does this monitor work with games consoles? I have to say, I don't use games consoles myself. I don't own games consoles, so I don't test in that way. But I do look at user feedback, and I'm aware that this monitor, it would seem, at least at the moment, and how things are, it doesn't actually work with the Xbox Series X at 2560 by 1440. Currently, the PlayStation 5 doesn't even support that resolution. It does have a 4K UHD downsampling mode, so you can run it in sort of a pseudo 4K mode, and it can accept a 4K signal at up to 60 Hz, so you can use it like that. But in terms of its high refresh rate capability at the native resolution, it doesn't really work there. So really, for modern games consoles, I tend to recommend something like the BenQ EX2780Q. Had lots of positive feedback from console users there. And in terms of how it compares to this one, just a quick comparison. I don't want to get into too much detail here. Largely similar, not quite as responsive as this one though. Has integrated speakers and an integrated subwoofer, has an OSD remote, so it had some little features which could appeal, in fact, to console users as well. And it tends to be a fairly affordable model as well. The price is usually a little bit higher than this Gigabyte monitor, but not substantially so. So to me, both of these monitors certainly have their place. So that's really all there is to this review of the Gigabyte M27Q. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.